Millionaire marries an ugly obese woman on a bet with friends, but on the wedding night, the millionaire was surprised when the sky was painted in shades of gold and orange as the sun set on the horizon, reflecting off the calm ocean waters. Nathan Thompson's yacht, a symbol of luxury and power, gently swayed to the rhythm of the waves. On the upper deck, the party was in full swing with a parade of influential people, business tycoons, models, and longtime friends. Champagne bottles popped, laughter echoed, and the music blared. Nathan watched it all from a distance, leaning against the deck railing with a glass of champagne in hand. His presence radiated confidence. At 35, he was living proof that success wasn't about luck but strategy. Owner of an empire built through ruthless acquisitions, he was celebrating yet another victory. A billion-dollar acquisition that would further solidify his name in the market. "Bored, Nathan?" Matthew Foster's casual voice cut through the noise of the party. With a whiskey glass in hand and the smirk of someone who knew exactly where to push, Matthew approached his friend. He was one of the few people who could speak to Nathan without a filter. "Bored? I just closed the deal of the year." Nathan smiled, but there was something mechanical about his response. "Yeah, just another one for your collection," Matthew replied, leaning against the bar beside him. "But tell me, when was the last time you did something that truly swept you off your feet? Something that made you feel alive without the safety of having everything planned out?" Nathan narrowed his eyes, intrigued. "What are you getting at? My work is that. I live for these challenges." "These aren't real challenges, Nathan." Matthew took a sip of his whiskey and continued provocatively. "You play with marked cards. You always know the outcome before you even start. When was the last time you took a risk that really mattered?" Nathan let out a short laugh, but deep down, the provocation unsettled him. "And what do you suggest? That I gamble my fortune on a roulette game?" "No, something more interesting." Matthew paused, the mischievous grin spreading across his face. "I want to see you do something outside your comfort zone. How about marrying a woman who has nothing to do with you for 6 months? No prenuptial agreement, no financial benefits." Nathan burst into loud laughter, drawing glances from those around him. "Marriage? Have you lost your mind?" "Are you scared?" Matthew teased. Nathan stepped forward, meeting his friend's gaze head-on. "I never back down from a challenge." "Then it's settled. If you can stay married for 6 months without running away, I'll give you $50 million. Matthew raised his whiskey glass. "But if you quit before the time is up, you lose." Nathan took a long sip of champagne, feeling his ego swell as the alcohol mixed dangerously within him. His mind told him to think it through, but his pride had already taken over. He raised his glass and toasted, "Deal." The next morning, Nathan woke up with a pounding headache and fragments of the previous night replaying in his mind. Lying on his king-sized bed, he stared at the ceiling, wondering if he should just call Matthew and say it had all been drunken nonsense. But his pride wouldn't allow it. As he headed downstairs for breakfast, he found Matthew already seated on the veranda, relaxed with several folders spread across the table. The scent of fresh coffee and sea air filled the space. "I knew you wouldn't back out," Matthew grinned, sliding a folder toward Nathan. "I'm still trying to figure out how you talked me into this." Nathan sat down and grabbed a cup of coffee, hoping to shake off the hangover. "You're too competitive to say no." Matthew opened the folder. "Now, meet the perfect woman for this challenge, Isabella Brooks." Nathan quickly flipped through the dossier. The first photo showed a woman with a modest appearance, brown hair tied in a bun, and determined eyes. She wasn't the type of woman he usually surrounded himself with, glamorous models and high society socialites. Isabella was different, and that intrigued him. "Who is she?" Nathan asked, scanning the information in the folder. "Director of an NGO focused on education in underserved communities. Smart, independent, and most importantly, she doesn't care about your money. The NGO is facing financial difficulties, so if you offer a good sum, she'll probably agree to meet." Nathan placed the folder back on the table and took a deep breath. "And what if she tells me to get lost?" Matthew laughed. "Then at least we'll have fun trying. But something tells me she won't say no. Money may not matter to her, but saving the project she believes in does." Across the city, Isabella Brooks sat in her small office, surrounded by papers and spreadsheets showing declining donations. She rested her head in her hands as she read the latest report. The situation was dire. If she didn't find an investor in the coming months, she would have to shut down the NGO and halt educational programs that directly impacted the lives of hundreds of children. When the phone rang, she almost ignored it, but something made her pick up. "Isabella Brooks, good morning." "Good morning, Ms. Brooks. This is Nathan Thompson's assistant. He would like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss a potential sponsorship proposal." Isabella frowned at the name. She knew who Nathan Thompson was. His name appeared in news articles, interviews, and stories of ruthless takeovers. He represented everything she criticized about the corporate world. Her first instinct was to decline, but she hesitated. What if he really could help save the NGO? "When would this meeting be?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the Thompson Holdings headquarters." Isabella hung up the phone and stood still for a moment, staring into the empty space in front of her. Something told her that accepting this meeting could completely change the course of her life. But whether for better or worse, she had yet to find out. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of conversations filled the elegant room. The cafe, chosen by Nathan Thompson, wasn't just sophisticated. It was the kind of place where business deals worth millions were closed over a shot of espresso, where the discreet silence seemed to be part of the furniture. For Nathan, it was the ideal setting to resolve business quickly and efficiently. Seated at a corner table, he adjusted his wristwatch and checked his phone for the third time, a habit he couldn't shake. Isabella Brooks was 5 minutes late, something unusual for him, as he rarely had to wait for anyone. When he finally saw her walk in, he automatically straightened up, watching as she crossed the room with a firm and determined posture. Isabella wore a simple white blouse, paired with a dark blue blazer that highlighted her brown eyes. Her hair was pulled back into a practical bun, with no signs of extravagance. She wasn't the type of woman who would immediately draw attention at glamorous events, but there was something about her, a quiet, almost defiant strength that kept his gaze fixed as she approached. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sitting down without asking for permission. "The traffic was worse than usual." Nathan gave a slight smile. "No problem." A waiter approached, and she ordered a black coffee, no sugar. Direct and to the point, Nathan noted. Unlike the women he was used to, Isabella seemed oblivious to the game of appearances. She didn't care whether she impressed or not. "So," she began, without wasting time, "why would a man like you be interested in my NGO?" Nathan leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I'm always looking for good opportunities. Supporting social projects isn't new to me." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "That's not what the newspapers say. Most of the time, you support your own interests, and that usually involves destroying anyone in your way." Nathan smiled, but he felt the weight of her provocation. She wasn't wrong, but it wasn't something he intended to admit just yet. "People like to exaggerate my tactics." Isabella studied him for a moment, then took a sip of her coffee. He was charming, no doubt, but also extremely dangerous. She had known that even before arriving at the meeting. Still, her curiosity kept her there. After all, why would a billionaire with access to any kind of partnership choose an NGO with no national relevance? "And what exactly do you want from me, Mr. Thompson?" Nathan held her gaze. There was no hesitation in his eyes. This was the moment to make his proposal. I want you to marry me." The coffee almost went down the wrong pipe, but Isabella managed to control herself, carefully setting the cup back on its saucer. She looked at him in disbelief, then laughed. A genuine laugh, something rare in Nathan's formal meetings. "You've got to be joking." "I'm serious." Isabella crossed her arms, still skeptical. "Out of all the people in this country, you chose someone who doesn't fit into your world." "Exactly," he replied calmly. "I don't want someone from my social circle. I want someone who's different, authentic." He leaned in a little more, never breaking eye contact. "Someone who will challenge me." She laughed again, but this time her gaze was more calculated. "You don't know me, so why do you think I'm the right choice?" "Because you have a clear motivation." Nathan let the comment hang in the air, waiting for her reaction. Isabella narrowed her eyes. "The NGO." "Exactly. If you accept, you'll have guaranteed funding for the next 5 years. No bureaucracy, no waiting on donations." For a moment, her heart raced. What he was offering could save years of work. But at the same time, the offer was as absurd as it was tempting. Marrying Nathan Thompson. It was like selling her soul to someone she didn't trust. "And what else do I get out of this?" she asked sarcastically. "Full freedom to continue your work. This is just a contract, nothing more." Isabella noticed the coldness in his tone. To him, this was just another deal. No emotions were involved, and she didn't expect any. But even so, something inside her hesitated. "And if I agree, how exactly does this work?" "A public marriage, social appearances at events. The press will believe the narrative. You just need to be by my side for 6 months. After that, we each go our separate ways." Isabella watched him for a few seconds in silence. She wasn't naive. She knew there was more to the offer. He hadn't chosen her randomly. But at the same time, the idea of securing the NGO's future was impossible to ignore. "Why do you need me? With your money, you could hire any actress to play the role." Nathan gave a faint smile. "Actresses don't challenge me." She looked away for a moment, considering. It wasn't an easy decision. Accepting meant exposing her personal life to the public, something she had always avoided, but refusing could mean the end of her project. When she looked back at him, her tone was firm. "If I agree, you need to understand one thing. I'm not a chess piece. I have my own terms, and you won't control me." Nathan smiled, not out of superiority, but with genuine respect. "You're turning out to be more interesting than I expected." Isabella finished her coffee and stood, grabbing her bag. "I haven't said yes yet." "But you'll think about it," Nathan said confidently. She paused before responding, keeping her gaze fixed on him. "I will think about it. But know this, if I enter this, it won't be as easy as you're imagining." With that, she turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Nathan alone. He watched as she disappeared down the street. A strange sensation came over him. It wasn't just about the challenge anymore. He was genuinely curious about who Isabella Brooks really was. And for the first time in a long while, Nathan Thompson felt that he might not be completely in control. The meeting room was illuminated by the soft light streaming through the large glass windows. Nathan Thompson sat at the head of the table, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, as his lawyers reviewed the final details of the contract. Across from him, Isabella Brooks maintained her firm posture, her face serene and her eyes sharp, carefully analyzing each clause. Despite the cold, corporate atmosphere, something vibrated in the air, a latent tension between two completely different worlds. She flipped a page of the document, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Nathan. "Before I sign, let me make something clear. This won't be like you're used to." Nathan rested his elbows on the table and interlaced his fingers, watching her with a faint smile. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means I'm not an extension of you. I won't show up wherever you want, just to take pictures. If you're expecting a submissive wife, forget it." He wasn't fazed. If anything, he seemed almost amused. "I'm not expecting you to be submissive. I'm expecting you to be convincing." Isabella held the pen, but didn't sign yet. "My space will be respected. I'll continue running the NGO without interference, and the funding will be provided as stipulated in the contract." Nathan nodded. "It's all there, according to your terms." She finally signed, her signature firm and decisive. When she finished, Nathan took the pen and signed as well, sealing the agreement that would change their lives. "Looks like we're husband and wife now, at least on paper," he said with a slightly sarcastic tone. Isabella closed the folder and met his gaze. "At least on paper." The ceremony took place a few days later, in a discreet setting, with no photographers or guests beyond the necessary witnesses, no extravagant dresses or grand decorations. Isabella wore a simple yet elegant white dress, while Nathan opted for a classic black suit. The justice of the peace officiated the ceremony in less than 20 minutes, and at the end they shook hands instead of sharing the traditional kiss. For Nathan, this was supposed to be just another event on his packed agenda. But something felt off. It wasn't how he had imagined it. The simple fact that Isabella didn't bow to expectations unsettled him, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself. As soon as the ceremony ended, he turned to her and joked, "Excited for the party?" Isabella raised an eyebrow. "You mean the lavish party where I'll be paraded around like a trophy?" Nathan chuckled, but she wasn't joking. "Relax," he replied. "The party is just for appearances. You don't have to like it, you just have to pretend." She gave a small, sarcastic smile. "Ah, yes, pretending. You seem to be an expert at that." Night fell quickly, and the welcome event for the couple was held in the ballroom of a luxurious hotel. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, champagne circulated on silver trays, and the business elite gathered, curious to see Nathan Thompson's new wife. Isabella entered arm in arm with him, maintaining her composure as camera flashes captured their every move. She wore a floor-length navy blue dress that highlighted her natural elegance, though she wasn't there to impress anyone. Nathan, on the other hand, wore his practiced smile, greeting familiar faces and introducing his wife to important figures. For a while, Isabella played along. She smiled politely, answered superficial questions, and accepted the champagne glasses offered to her. But her patience was running thin. The breaking point came when Nathan introduced her to one of the company's top investors, an arrogant man who looked her up and down as if assessing the price of a commodity. "So, this is your new acquisition?" he joked with an air of superiority. Nathan laughed, thinking he was playing the social game. "She's a valuable investment." Isabella froze for a second, processing those words. Her face flushed, but she didn't let her anger show. Instead, she gently pulled her arm away from Nathan, turned to the investor, and said with a sharp smile, "I'm not an acquisition, sir. I'm a contract with very clear terms. And unlike a traditional investment, I have a mind of my own." An awkward silence hung in the air for a few moments before the investor let out a nervous laugh and excused himself. Nathan stood there, stunned, as Isabella grabbed a champagne glass from a passing tray. "Do I need to teach you how to behave at public events?" he whispered as he leaned toward her. "Do I need to teach you not to treat me like property?" She shot back without hesitation, meeting his gaze directly. For a moment, Nathan was at a loss for words. He was used to manipulating situations, but Isabella wasn't following the script. For the first time in a long while, he felt a twinge of discomfort at not being fully in control. Isabella downed the rest of her champagne in one gulp and placed the empty glass on a nearby table. "If you want me to keep pretending to be your wife, you'd better start respecting me. I won't be the decoration of your success." Nathan watched as she walked away, head held high, seemingly unfazed by the stares around her. He felt a mix of frustration and admiration growing inside him. With every step she took, Isabella made it clear that she wasn't like the other women he had manipulated. She didn't need him, and that terrified him. The rest of the night dragged on with formal conversations and social obligations, but Nathan was distracted. By the end, while everyone else celebrated the perfect couple, he couldn't get Isabella out of his mind. She was a complex puzzle, and now he was certain that this marriage would be more challenging than any business acquisition he had ever made. When the party finally ended, the two of them left the ballroom together, but the silence between them was heavy. In the car, Isabella stared out the window, while Nathan watched her reflection in the glass. "You don't make things easy, do you?" He broke the silence. She smiled faintly, still looking outside. Making things easy wasn't part of the deal. Nathan leaned his head back against the seat and sighed. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was prepared for what lay ahead. The morning silence was interrupted only by the soft sound of the coffee maker in the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the spacious, luxurious penthouse where Nathan and Isabella now lived. Despite the elegant setting, the tension in the air was palpable. Nathan sat at the marble table, a tablet in his hands, scrolling through financial reports while sipping his black coffee. Across from him, Isabella was reviewing a donation report for the NGO. They didn't exchange a word. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was an unspoken battle. Since the start of their sham marriage, their daily life had become a dance of conflict. Whenever they were together, every conversation felt like a minefield, but neither of them ever backed down. "Are you going out again today?" Nathan asked without looking up from the tablet. "Yes. I have an important meeting at the NGO." He closed the tablet and leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You spend more time there than you do here." Isabella looked up, unfazed. "And what did you expect? That I'd be decorating the house while you work?" Nathan smirked. "No, but I thought we'd at least be better at keeping up appearances." Isabella closed her report and crossed her arms on the table. "Keeping up appearances is exactly what we're doing. You show me off at parties, I smile for the cameras. But beyond that, I have my own world, Nathan." He opened his mouth to respond, but the ringing of her phone interrupted him. Isabella stood to answer it, leaving Nathan alone, irritated. This was how it was every day. She didn't yield, didn't let herself be drawn into his orbit. And somehow that provoked him more than any business rival ever had. Isabella wasn't an easy opponent to defeat, and maybe that's why he couldn't stop thinking about her. Later that afternoon, Nathan arrived home earlier than usual. He needed a moment away from the pressures of work, and secretly, he wanted to understand what kept Isabella so dedicated to her job. When he walked into the living room, he found her sitting on the couch, surrounded by papers, charts, and reports. She was so focused that she didn't even notice his presence. "Is this what you call taking a break?" he asked, announcing himself. Isabella looked up, but she didn't seem surprised. "I don't have much time for breaks. Every day counts." Nathan walked over and picked up one of the reports from the table. "You take this seriously, huh?" She smiled, but there was no sweetness in the gesture. When you see the direct impact of what you do, it's impossible not to. He flipped through the document, pretending to be interested, until a number caught his attention. "You're trying to get funding to open a new school." "Yes, in a community where access to basic education is practically non-existent." Nathan closed the report and set it back on the table. "And you think this will actually change anything?" Isabella clenched her jaw, but controlled herself before responding. "I've seen the difference it makes. Just because you don't care about social impact doesn't mean it doesn't exist." The statement hit like a direct blow, but Nathan kept his composure. He was used to criticism, but something about her tone unsettled him. Before he could reply, Isabella continued, "Speaking of social impact, I'd like to discuss one of your recent acquisitions." Nathan frowned, but didn't back down. "What about my acquisition?" "You bought a small textile factory, shut down local production, and outsourced everything to a foreign supplier. Hundreds of workers were laid off. Entire families are now without income. Is that what you call success?" Nathan crossed his arms and took a step back. "It's not about success, Isabella. It's just business. The factory was inefficient, and outsourcing was the best financial decision." "For you, maybe," she replied, standing up from the couch and facing him head-on. "But for the people who depended on those jobs, it was a disaster." "I can't save everyone," he retorted, frustrated. "My job is to make sure the company stays profitable." Isabella stepped closer, her gaze intense. "And that's exactly why you're trapped in this cycle of destruction. You never look beyond the numbers. You never think about the lives behind them." Silence fell between them, but it was anything but peaceful. Nathan felt the weight of her words, as if something deep inside him was trying to break through his defenses, but he wasn't ready to admit that yet. "You don't understand how my world works," he said, trying to sound firm, but his voice came out more hesitant than he'd intended. "No, Nathan, you're the one who doesn't understand how the real world works." She gathered the papers from the table and began stuffing them into her bag, as if the discussion was over for her, but in Nathan's mind, her words kept echoing. He had always been able to separate emotions from business, but now it seemed impossible to ignore the weight of that conversation. Hours later, Nathan was alone in his private office, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He stared into space, replaying the argument with Isabella. Ever since he'd married her, his mind had been invaded by doubts that had never bothered him before. He wondered if he really was ignoring the human consequences of his decisions. He thought back to how his father had taught him that business was like war. Either you win or you lose. There was no middle ground. But now, for the first time, victory felt bitter. In the background, he heard the soft sound of Isabella's footsteps in the hallway. She was heading to the bedroom. Just before she entered, he almost called her name, but the words didn't come out. That night, as he lay in bed beside her, each of them on opposite sides, he realized he could no longer ignore the seed of doubt she had planted. And worse yet, he knew that this wouldn't be their last argument. The next morning, Nathan woke up before the sun had risen and watched Isabella sleep for a few minutes. There was something fascinating about her, not just her appearance, but the quiet strength she carried. She wasn't the kind of woman who would settle for crumbs or play the role of a trophy wife. She fought for something bigger, something he didn't fully understand. As explosive as their dynamic was, Nathan couldn't deny the truth. Isabella was challenging him to see the world through a new lens. And though he wouldn't say it out loud, he was beginning to wonder if she was right. The sun hid behind grey clouds as Isabella walked into the small NGO office, the sound of her heels echoing through the empty hallway. She had arrived earlier than usual, but there was a restlessness within her that had kept her awake the night before. A mix of intuition and unease pulled her into this unusual morning. On the desk, a pile of old documents awaited her. They were financial reports from the NGO and records of companies that had contributed donations in the past. She was reviewing them in the hopes of finding a potential donor to help expand one of their education projects. As she flipped through the pages, a name stopped her breath for a moment. Thompson Holdings. Her eyes locked onto the page, as if the paper could give her immediate answers. The name appeared as one of the companies responsible for acquiring her father's former company, Brooks Textiles, years before the factory went bankrupt. The weight of that name hit Isabella like a punch to the gut. She knew Nathan Thompson was a magnate known for his aggressive acquisitions, But she had never directly linked her past to the man she had married. Her hands began to tremble as she pulled more documents, confirming her worst fear. Nathan had been responsible for acquiring her father's company, and it was this acquisition that had led to the factory's bankruptcy. The same event that shortly after had triggered Charles Brooks's emotional decline and ultimately his death. Isabella leaned back in the chair, the weight of the memories washing over her. She remembered her father's tired face, the days he would come home defeated, trying to hide the shame of losing everything he had built over a lifetime. She felt a knot in her throat, but didn't let the tears fall. She took a deep breath, closed the documents, and left the office without saying a word to anyone. She needed time to think and decide what to do with the information. Nathan was on the sofa in the living room, his shirt unbuttoned and a glass of water in his hand, when Isabella walked through the door of the penthouse. She stood silently for a moment, watching him. He looked more relaxed than usual, as if the weight of corporate decisions wasn't pressing down on him at that moment. But to her, he wasn't just the man running an empire. Now, he was also the man responsible for her family's downfall. "Rough day?" he asked, noticing her presence. Isabella hesitated but decided not to confront him, at least not yet. "Just like any other," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. He stood up and, sensing her distance, but not understanding the reason, tried to make conversation. "I'm thinking about stopping by the NGO tomorrow. I promised one of the teachers I'd check out the reading project with the kids." Isabella looked at him with suspicion. Since when did Nathan Thompson take an interest in social projects? But instead of rejecting the idea, she saw an opportunity. "Great! It could be useful for you to see firsthand what it's like to build something with people in mind, not just numbers." Nathan smiled, but he felt the sting of her words. Still, he didn't respond. There was something about Isabella that made him accept being challenged, something that disarmed him without him realizing it. The next morning, Nathan arrived at the NGO wearing dark jeans and a casual shirt, a far cry from his usual suit and tie. When he entered, he was greeted by a warm, middle-aged teacher. The children, some drawing, others flipping through colorful books, were comfortable in the simple yet lively space. He observed everything carefully. At first, he tried to see the visit as a strategic move, a symbolic act to show Isabella he was willing to collaborate. But as the minutes passed, he realized he couldn't maintain that facade. A 6-year-old girl approached him and handed him a drawing of a smiling sun. "This is for you," she said with the innocence typical of her age. Nathan took the drawing, and for a moment something shifted inside him. It wasn't nostalgia, it was something deeper, a connection he couldn't name. As he walked between the tables, listening to the laughter and seeing the bright eyes of the children, a memory hit him. Himself, as a young man, sitting next to Charles Brooks on a university bench, discussing how they could change the world with innovative ideas. Charles had been one of his mentors, someone who had believed in him at the beginning of his career. The memory of the kind, principled man made his stomach churn. He didn't like thinking about his past, but here, in this room filled with hope, the past was knocking on his door. At the end of the day, Nathan returned home and found Matthew waiting for him on the balcony. His friend had a serious expression, different from his usual laid-back demeanor. "I have something to give you," Matthew said, handing him an old letter. Nathan took the yellowed envelope, his name handwritten in familiar script. His heart raced. "Charles gave me this letter before he died," Matthew explained. "He asked me to give it to you when I thought you were ready to hear what he had to say." Nathan swallowed hard and opened the envelope with trembling hands. The first words of the letter made the ground seem to vanish beneath his feet. "Nathan, if you're reading this, it's because Matthew believed the time was right. I always knew you would be successful. Your ambition and determination were obvious from day one. But success can be a trap. You can conquer the world and lose yourself at the same time. When you bought my company, I didn't blame you. I knew it was part of the game. But I hope that one day you'll be able to see beyond the numbers and understand the human impact of your decisions. Not to fix the past, that's already behind us, but to make sure the future you build doesn't destroy other lives. With affection, Charles Brooks Nathan closed his eyes, gripping the letter tightly. Charles's voice echoed in his mind, like a ghost he didn't know how to face. The weight of the words was crushing, and for the first time he felt that his achievements were stained by something bigger than he was willing to admit. When he lifted his gaze, he found Matthew watching him with empathy. "What are you going to do with this?" Nathan didn't respond immediately. His mind was in turmoil, and one certainty overwhelmed him. Isabella didn't know about the letter, but when she found out, it might be too late to fix everything. The soft wind swayed the curtains on the balcony as Nathan stared at the horizon, Charles Brooks' letter still in his hands. The yellowed paper, creased and marked by time, felt heavier than it should. He had read it so many times in the past few hours that the words were etched into his mind, but that didn't ease the weight of guilt. Matthew's footsteps approached from behind, and he sat down next to his friend, placing a glass of whiskey on the table between them. "You've been torturing yourself since yesterday. This isn't going to get you anywhere." Nathan scoffed, rubbing his face with his hands. "The problem is, I can't ignore what I did anymore. I destroyed his legacy. And the worst part is, he forgave me before I even realized the damage I'd caused." Matthew took a sip of his whiskey before responding. "Charles knew who you were, Leo. He saw your potential, but he also knew your flaws. He didn't write that letter to condemn you. He wrote it to make you think. And that's exactly what you're doing." "I don't know how to change the past." Nathan leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling. "And Isabella, she's going to hate me when she finds out." Matthew hesitated for a moment. "She doesn't know about the connection between you and her father's company yet?" "No." Nathan closed his eyes. "And I don't know how to tell her." Isabella, who had just arrived home moments earlier, froze when she heard her name in the conversation. She stayed quiet in the hallway, hidden in the shadow of the door, listening to every word. But what came next made her feel as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. "And the bet?" Matthew asked in a low voice. "Are you still thinking about it?" Nathan sighed, guilt heavy in his breath. "The bet was the stupidest thing I've ever done. In the beginning, I thought it would just be another game, but it's not a game anymore, Matthew. I actually care about her." Isabella's eyes widened, her heart racing. Her mind tried to process what she had just heard, but the impact was devastating. The bet, a game. All of it, the marriage, Nathan's affection, had been a lie. Feeling suffocated, she backed away from the hallway, her hurried, uneven footsteps echoing through the room. Nathan heard the noise and stood up immediately, alarmed. "Isabella!" He saw her walking toward the door, her face hardened, her gaze fixed ahead. "Wait!" She stopped, but didn't turn around. "I can't believe I was so stupid." Nathan rushed to her, reaching out to touch her arm, but she pulled away as if his touch burned her. Finally, she turned around, and he saw the pain reflected in her eyes. "You were using me this whole time?" Her voice was low, but it carried a controlled fury. "This marriage was just a game to you. Isabella, it's not like that." He tried to explain, but the words seemed to slip away from him. "At first, yes, it was a bet, but it's not anymore. She laughed bitterly. "So it's true. Let me explain." Nathan felt the desperation rising. "In the beginning, I took the bet because I was an idiot. But you changed everything. I didn't expect to feel this way. I didn't expect you to be a difficult piece on your chessboard," she interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. Is that all I am to you, Nathan? Another opportunity to win a bet? No. He stepped forward, but she backed away again. Isabella, please. I know I made a mistake. I know I should have told you sooner. But this isn't about the bet anymore. I care about you. You're different from anyone I've ever met. She shook her head, as if trying to rid herself of his words. You think that's enough? You think saying you care is going to erase all of this? I trusted you, Nathan. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. Nathan didn't know what to say. Her words hit like sharp knives, each one cutting deeper into his conscience. You knew, she continued, her voice trembling, that the only reason I agreed to this marriage was to save the NGO. And yet you deceived me. You made it seem like there was something real. There is something real. Nathan's voice was barely a whisper, almost a plea for forgiveness. Isabella stared at him for a moment, as if searching for some truth in his words, but all she found was the reflection of her own pain. I can't even look at you right now. She opened the door and left without saying another word. Nathan stood frozen for what felt like hours. The sound of the door closing still echoed in his mind, like a final sentence. Matthew stepped into the room, cautious, but he didn't say anything. He knew there were no right words at that moment. When Nathan finally moved, his steps were slow and heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. He sat down on the sofa, staring at nothing. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. The pain of losing control over his business was something he understood and knew how to handle. But losing Isabella was different. It felt like a part of him was slowly unraveling. He picked up his phone but didn't have the courage to call her. He knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation, and she might not even answer. Yet, as he stared at the device, one inescapable truth formed in his mind. He couldn't keep pretending to be the man Isabella thought she had known. If he wanted to win her back and redeem himself, he would have to confront the truth about who he was and what he had done. Not just for her, but for himself. He looked at Charles Brooks's letter lying on the table. It wasn't just a message from the past. It was a reminder of the man he needed to become. But the question that echoed in his mind was it already too late? The Thompson Holdings meeting room felt colder than usual, or at least it did to Nathan. Sitting at the head of the table, he faced the tense expressions of the directors around him. Their faces shifted between distrust and irritation, and he knew why. His recent decisions were destabilizing the company. You really cancelled the Graintex acquisition? One of the directors asked, barely masking the accusatory tone. Nathan nodded, his voice steady. Yes. The factory will not be shut down and the workers will keep their jobs. Do you have any idea what kind of financial impact this will have? Another director questioned. We were expecting a boost to our profit margins. I know exactly what the financial impact will be, Nathan replied coolly. That's why I'm redirecting part of the capital to social projects. We're not going to focus only on short-term profit, but on long-term sustainability. A wave of disapproval murmured through the room. Nathan knew resistance was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to be this intense. They weren't just worried about the numbers. They were furious because he was dismantling the logic that had sustained the empire for years. Nathan, the chairman of the board said gravely, this isn't what we do here. We're an investment firm, not a charity. Nathan sighed but kept his composure. Maybe that's exactly what needs to change. Companies can be both profitable and responsible. The meeting ended without consensus. Nathan left the room feeling the weight of the decisions he had made, but he wasn't willing to back down. If losing his position as CEO was the price to pay for doing the right thing, he was prepared to accept it. In the days that followed, Nathan immersed himself in the activities of Isabella's NGO, showing up unannounced and helping wherever he could. It wasn't just an attempt at redemption, it was a new way of seeing the world. He met with teachers, spoke with children, and saw firsthand the impact that small actions could have on so many lives. One morning, while helping unload boxes of donated books, one of the teachers approached him with a shy smile. "I never thought I'd see Nathan Thompson carrying books," he chuckled, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Neither did I." But it wasn't just him who was changing. Nathan's involvement with the NGO was starting to make Isabella uneasy. At first, she had believed he was doing it out of guilt or to redeem himself in her eyes. But as time went on, she saw something different. He was genuinely involved, expecting nothing in return. That afternoon, as Nathan organized books in the improvised library, Isabella watched him from a distance. He didn't notice her, too focused on stacking the volumes neatly. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the times he had surprised her, the way he listened to the children's stories, the way he cared about understanding the impact of every decision. But at the same time, the weight of the bet and their past still lingered. She couldn't ignore how much he had hurt her. Trusting that this change wasn't just temporary was difficult. When he finished organizing the books and turned around, he saw her standing in the doorway. His gaze softened, but he didn't take a step toward her. He knew the next move had to be hers. "You've been coming here a lot lately," she said, crossing her arms. Nathan shrugged. "It's a good place to learn what really matters." Isabella took a deep breath. "And what have you learned?" He walked toward her slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. "I've learned that what I was doing before was empty. That success without purpose is just an endless race." She looked away, trying to control the storm of emotions within her. "Do you expect this to erase what happened between us?" Nathan shook his head. "No, and I'm not doing this to prove anything to you. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." The silence between them was broken by the sound of children running down the hallway, their laughter filling the air. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the feelings that kept surfacing. "I need time," she whispered. "I know," he replied without pressure, "and I'll give you as much time as you need." Meanwhile, in the corporate world, the consequences of Nathan's decisions were piling up. The headlines in the newspapers talked about Thompson Holdings' declining stock prices and speculated about Nathan's possible removal as CEO. He knew that every decision he had made was being used against him, but he had no regrets. That night, alone in his penthouse, he stared at the horizon, lost in thought. His phone vibrated beside him, and he answered without checking who it was. "Nathan," the chairman of the board said firmly, "an emergency meeting has been scheduled to decide your future at the company." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He had known this moment would come, but hearing the words out loud made it all the more real. "I'll be there," he replied before hanging up. As he set the phone down on the table, he felt something different. Before, the idea of losing his position as CEO would have been a nightmare, an unacceptable defeat. Now it was just a consequence. He had found a new purpose, and no matter what the board decided, he wasn't going to abandon the path he had chosen. The next morning, Isabella learned about the meeting through the press, and for the first time since discovering the bet, she felt a wave of concern. Nathan was about to lose everything, but he seemed determined to keep going. She wasn't sure if that was bravery or stubbornness, but there was something genuine in his change that she couldn't ignore. As she reflected on it, she remembered her father's words from many years ago. People can make mistakes, but the true test is whether they're willing to correct them. Isabella knew she wasn't ready to fully trust Nathan yet, but she also couldn't deny that he was trying. And maybe she needed to be there to see how this story would end. For the first time, she wondered if he really was changing for the better, not just for her, but for himself. The Thompson Holdings boardroom was engulfed in an almost reverent silence. The cold glow of the white lights reflected off the glass walls, giving the room a tense, sterile atmosphere. At the head of the table, Nathan Thompson stared at the board members, his jaw clenched and his heart beating faster than he would have liked. He was used to tough negotiations, but this time was different. This meeting wasn't just about business, it was about who he had become. "Let's be clear," the board chairman said, breaking the silence. "Your recent decisions have put the company's profits at risk. If we don't act now, we could suffer even greater losses in the market." Nathan took a deep breath and straightened his posture. He knew he had to be firm, but before he could respond, the door to the room opened, drawing everyone's attention. Isabella entered with determined steps, wearing a simple dress and carrying a folder of documents. Her eyes met Nathan's for a brief second, and he felt a wave of relief and surprise at the same time. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, positioning herself next to him. The board chairman frowned. "Mrs. Thompson, we weren't expecting you to be here." "Neither was he," she replied, casting a small smile at Nathan before turning to face the group. "But I thought it was important." Nathan felt his chest tighten. The simple fact that she was there meant more than any word of support. He knew he still had a lot to make up for between them, but in that moment, he wasn't alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isabella continued, "I understand you're concerned about the recent changes. But I'm here to present, alongside Nathan, a new strategic plan. A plan that can bring sustainable results for the company while creating positive impact." The directors exchanged glances, some with skepticism, others with curiosity. Nathan took the cue to continue. "For a long time, our company has focused solely on short-term profits. That strategy brought us this far, but it's also made us vulnerable. The market is changing, and consumers are demanding social responsibility from companies." He scanned the room, looking for any sign of receptiveness. "What we're proposing is a hybrid business model that maintains our traditional investments while allocating a portion of our resources to social projects. This includes partnerships with NGOs, funding education in underserved communities, and supporting small local businesses." Isabella picked up where he left off. "Companies that integrate social impact into their strategies see greater customer retention and improved market reputation. This isn't just an altruistic gesture, it's a smart way to ensure sustainable growth." For a few seconds, silence once again dominated the room. Nathan could feel the tension as the directors processed the proposal. Then, one of the most influential executives, who rarely spoke, finally voiced his thoughts. "Do you think this change is enough to reverse the damage that's already been done?" Isabella responded quickly. "What's done can't be undone. But we can start now to build a different legacy, one that balances profit and responsibility. If we don't try, we'll lose more than money. We'll lose relevance." Nathan added, "We're prepared to present quarterly reports proving the model's viability. All we're asking for is a chance." The silence that followed wasn't one of disapproval, it was one of contemplation. After a few minutes of hushed conversations among the directors, the chairman stood up. "Let's take a vote." Nathan's heart raced, but he kept his gaze steady. One by one, the directors raised their hands in approval. Once the majority was reached, the chairman gave a small nod. "You've got your chance. Don't waste it, Nathan." As the meeting ended and the board members began to leave, Nathan and Isabella remained in the room. He let out a long exhale, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. Isabella watched him, her gaze soft but cautious. "Did you know I'd be here?" she asked with a faint smile. "Not even in my most optimistic dreams," he replied, chuckling nervously. She approached him slowly until she was standing by his side. "I've seen you change, Nathan. I'm not saying I fully trust you yet, but I'm willing to see where this can take us." He took her hands, feeling the comforting warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. I love you, Isabella, and I deeply regret everything I did to hurt you. I'm not asking you to forget the past, but I want you to know I'm trying to be a better man for myself and for you." She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm yet gentle. "I believe you can be better, but I'm not going to let you relax. You'll continue to be challenged." Nathan smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." Months later, Thompson Holdings was on the road to recovery. The stock prices were rising again, and the company had gained media attention as a model for corporate reinvention. But for Nathan, the real success was the creation of the Charles Brooks Foundation, a project he and Isabella had envisioned together. The foundation would invest in education for underserved communities, offering scholarships, vocational training, and support for small local businesses. It was the perfect tribute to Charles's legacy, something Isabella had never imagined would be possible. At a press conference to officially announce the foundation, Nathan and Isabella stood before the cameras, holding hands. When the Q&A session ended, Nathan leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Do you think he'd be proud?" Isabella squeezed his hand. "I'm sure of it." Later that evening at home, as they organized documents, Isabella took Nathan's hand and placed it over her belly. He froze for a moment before realizing what she was implying. "You're—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his eyes filling with emotion. She smiled. "Yes, we're going to have a baby." Nathan pulled her into a tight embrace, overwhelmed by a mix of joy, relief, and hope. For the first time in years, he wasn't just chasing victories, he was building a future. And with Isabella by his side, he knew that future would be far more meaningful than anything he had ever imagined. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.